Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to host this panel, which will be followed by closing remarks by President King Alexander. It's really wonderful to have someone with the credibility of Marjorie Hines as our speaker on this panel. Marjorie has been on the forefront fighting for First Amendment rights, and she's not afraid to take on liberals who want to be politically correct, or conservatives who want to censor violence. And you can read about her books and her accomplishments in the program. I don't want to take time away from her by doing that. But I believe that the highest compliment one scholar can pay to another is to cite their work. And I have cited Marjorie's work in my report on conflating violence and indecency in the media. And that has spun my work into 2 law review articles where I also cite Marge's work. So I am delighted that she could be with us today. And so without further ado, Marjorie Hines.
Thank you. I think the first order of business will be to open a bottle of water. The second will be to put on my glasses so I can read my notes. Thank you, Craig, and thanks to everybody who organized this for inviting me. I'm honored to be part of this conference, especially since it included such champions of civil liberties as my old law school classmate, Erwin Chemerinsky, who, by the way, was a very quiet guy in law school. You just had no idea what was going to happen. Today I want to talk about government funding of free expression. And I admit that this might not seem to be as urgent or dramatic an issue as some of the ones you've probably heard about in the preceding days of this conference. For example, criminal prosecutions that go on of artists and other people who insult the government, death threats and even assassinations of writers who are accused of blaspheming religion. But as a structural issue, a government's lack of support for creative and intellectual activity also really does have a profound effect on society. And the frailty of the United States government's commitment to funding the arts and humanities and supporting nonprofit public broadcasting and creating other alternatives to our for-profit news and entertainment systems has been evident for a long time. And I think this lack of serious commitment to supporting these alternatives has not only narrowed the range of cultural experiences that we have available to us, but has really weakened our democracy by narrowing our political perspectives. So let me start with a cautionary tale. In 1991, I was an ACLU lawyer in Boston. I moved to New York City to start an art censorship project at the National ACLU. And the impetus for this was broadly termed the culture wars, or more specifically, political attacks that have been going on for a couple of years against a very small federal agency called the National Endowment for the Arts, or the NEA for short. And the attacks had begun 2 years before when Donald Wildman, the head of a religious right group called the American Family Association, discovered that a large luminous photograph by an artist named Andres Serrano with the unfortunate title Piss Christ had been included in a museum exhibit that received some NEA funds. And to make matters worse, each of the artists in the exhibit, including Serrano, had received a prize of $15,000. So indirectly, Serrano had gotten some government money for this particular photograph. And it's a very beautiful photograph. If you haven't seen it, there are many places on the internet where you can find it just by Googling it. And without the title, you would think it was a very reverential image. But the title was, as I say, unfortunate given the political consequences. So the $15,000 wasn't exactly a vast sum of money, but senators and congressmen led by the redoubtable Jesse Helms of North Carolina lost no time in excoriating the little NEA for subsidizing this perceived insult to their religion. Helms and his fellow Senator Alphonse D'Amato of New York took after Serrano one day in May of 1989 on the Senate floor. I'll give you a couple of samplings from their rhetoric. Piss Christ, D'Amato said, was a despicable display of vulgarity. It was trash, shocking, abhorrent, completely undeserving of any recognition. And Helms brought a similar, shall we say, lack of aesthetic nuance to what Serrano was doing in this work. Serrano was a blasphemer, he said. He's not an artist, he's a jerk. That's all right for him to be a jerk, but let him be a jerk on his own time and with his own resources. Do not dishonor our Lord. So suffice it to say that Serrano's artistic purpose in critiquing the cheapening of Christianity through his urinary metaphor was lost amid the political frenzy. Things didn't get better when, shortly afterward, it was discovered that the NEA had also funded a traveling retrospective exhibit dedicated to the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe. And although much of Mapplethorpe's work, which can be seen in many major museums, consists of gorgeous, very formal, tasteful nudes and flowers, still lifes. The exhibit also included Mapplethorpe's notorious X portfolio, photographs of gay men in sadomasochistic leather regalia, outsized penises, not exactly safe sex practices. Perhaps most challenging, shall we say, of all these images in the X portfolio was the artist's own naked derriere with a handle of a bullwhip inserted in his anus. So Mapplethorpe was clearly intending to shock, as well as to document the reality of his sexual world. He was a major artist, and it was a legitimate choice for the curators of this retrospective of his work to include the X portfolio. But needless to say, these subtleties were lost in the political outrage fed by the media. Not to mention the homophobia that mounted when it was revealed that this exhibition had been funded in part by the NEA. Helms was, again, so to speak, at the helm of this, and he told his Senate colleagues, quote, "It's an issue of soaking the taxpayer to fund the homosexual photography of Robert Mapplethorpe, who died of AIDS while spending the last years of his life promoting homosexuality." Helms was not subtle about his homophobia, and this rhetoric, even though it's less than 20 years old, may seem quite amazing today that somebody in the United States Congress would say this, but Helms was speaking to a prejudice that was still pretty strong in 1989. One of the ironies of this was a very powerful and successful rhetorical strategy for people like Helms and D'Amato and others in Congress who really didn't like the whole idea of government arts funding. The taxpayers' money. It's not that we're for censorship, it's all about the taxpayers' money. But it was less than a year later, in fact, that a museum in Cincinnati was criminally prosecuted for showing some of these, for hosting the retrospective exhibition, which had gone all around the country. But in Cincinnati, they actually brought criminal prosecutions against a museum for exhibiting this work. So there's something more was going on than just this argument about what is a prudent use of our tax dollars. So when I arrived at the ACLU in national office in 1991, a lawsuit growing out of these events was already in progress, and here's how the lawsuit came about. In 1990, tidbits from the application files of 4 performance artists who had been recommended for small grants by one of the agency's peer review panels had been leaked to the columnists Evans and Novak. 3 of these artists, Holly Hughes, Tim Miller, and John Fleck, were outspokenly gay and addressed gay sexuality in no uncertain terms in their work. The 4th, Karen Finley, later became infamous as the chocolate-smeared woman because in her show, We Keep Our Victims Ready, she had covered her nude body with chocolate to dramatize society's treatment of women. Needless to say, Evans and Novak's subsequent article, based on these leaked excerpts from the application files, like the descriptions of the Serrano and Mapplethorpe works the year before did not exactly reflect extensive research on the political and social concerns of the artists or the context in which these provocative and controversial moments appeared. Instead, they relit the sensationalist flames that had barely receded since the Serrano and Mapplethorpe uproar the year before. President George Bush I wrote to the NEA's then chair, John Quagmire, quote, "I don't believe a dime of the taxpayers' money should go into art that is clearly and visibly filth or patently blasphemous material," end quote. But Quagmire really didn't need this little hint from the president to get the message, and he vetoed the recommended grants. Well, Finley, Hughes, Miller, and Fleck were not exactly the sort to take this sort of thing lying down, so they filed a lawsuit. And it was pro bono representation from lawyers at the ACLU and the Center for Constitutional Rights that made the suit possible. And although one might argue, as a matter of prudent public policy, that a federal arts agency should not even have created a category for grants to performance artists, given that the performance art genre was, by definition, kind of in your face and dealt very directly with political and social issues. That choice had been made years before. And as matters stood, Quagmire's veto of the grants was both procedurally unusual and quite obviously driven by politics rather than evaluations of artistic merit. So that was the basic argument of the Finley versus NEA lawsuit, or as it colloquially became known, the case of the NEA 4. Well, shortly after this, just to make things a little more complicated, Congress passed a law requiring the NEA to take into account, quote, "general standards of decency and respect for the diverse beliefs and values of the American public in awarding grants." I call this the Decency and Respect Law for short. And its purpose was clearly to put an end to public relations disasters such as Mapplethorpe and Serrano. The Finley versus NEA lawsuit was now amended to add a new claim, a First Amendment challenge to the Decency and Respect Law. The legal theory here was that even in the awarding of grants or other benefits, First Amendment strictures do apply. That is, the government, even when it's giving out subsidies, can't engage in what we call viewpoint discrimination against unpopular or disfavored ideas such as indecency or disrespect for American values. So that's how matters stood when I got to the ACLU and started the Art Censorship Project in 1991. I was supposed to be the ACLU lawyer on the Finley legal team. When I arrived, the team was fighting a government motion to dismiss the whole case on the grounds, so the government lawyers said, that our suit really didn't state any viable legal claim, that government hadn't done anything wrong. Well, we won that motion, and in fact, we won the case in front of the federal district court, which ruled in favor of the artists on all counts. And the federal court system is district courts or trial courts, courts of appeal. Here in California, it's the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court at the top of the pyramid. So we were in the district court. The government's lawyers thereupon agreed to settle the artists' claims and give them their grants, which were about $5,000 each. This left, the only remaining part of the case was the challenge to the Decency and Respect Law. By this time, George I had been succeeded by Bill Clinton, and we were hoping that the new powers that be in the Clinton administration would decide not to appeal the district court victory that the artists had won and leave this vague decency and respect law in the dustbin of history where we thought it deserved to be. Certainly the arts establishment hoped the case would go away. Most arts leaders had distanced themselves from Finley and her co-plaintiffs in an effort to, they hoped or they thought, to save the NEA by showing that there were only a few bad apples. And in any case, the agency had cleaned up its act since those embarrassing days of Serrano and Mapplethorpe. This was a strategy decision that most of the arts establishment made. If they had made a different strategy decision, we can only sort of wonder whether the NEA would be in better or worse shape today than it is. But they distanced themselves, and that was not so easy to do in the 1990s because the NEA continued to be a target of headline-hunting congressmen searching for new scandals, and creative artists being what they are, there always did seem to be some new outrageous performance that could be accused of having received NEA support, however indirectly. But the Clinton administration evidently felt it had to defend the decency and respect law, so the case went up to the Court of Appeals. To the horror of the pragmatists and the art establishment, we won again. By now, I'd been around arts politics long enough to see their point. If the courts said to Congress, you can't impose these decency and respect criteria on an arts funding program, then damn it, there might well be enough votes in Congress to get rid of the agency entirely. And certainly, as I mentioned before, there were legislators who didn't like the whole idea of government arts funding and were delighted to use the NEA's political woes as ammunition to erase its whole budget line in the next appropriation. They didn't quite succeed, but the appropriations did continue to drop. And in a way, the ultimate fate of the NEA did seem to hinge on the Finley case, which the government now took up to the US Supreme Court, where they finally won. With Chief Justice Rehnquist in charge, this court was not very hospitable to arguments about the importance of free expression in government benefit programs. And in addition, I think the justices saw the political implications of another court victory for radical artists. So with the NEA still on the political hot seat, Justice O'Connor wrote an opinion for the Supreme Court majority, which essentially closed her eyes to political reality and said, well, this law only requires the NEA to consider decency and respect. It could still award grants to artists whose work was indecent or disrespectful. Now, both Justice Souter, who was the lone dissenter in the case, and Justices Scalia and Thomas, who thought decency and respect criteria were just fine, no constitutional problem. But they complained that O'Connor had defanged the law through her interpretation. They pointed out that a discriminatory consideration should at least be recognized for what it is. That is, to use several of Justice Souter's analogies, and here I'm going to my course pack from I actually just taught the Finley case in my class at UC San Diego last week. So here's some of Souter's analogies. What if the law required a panel of the NEA to apply criteria, quote, taking into consideration the centrality of Christianity to the American culture, or taking into consideration whether the artist is a communist, or taking into consideration the political message of the art? Would the court hold these considerations constitutional merely because the law hadn't required that they be given controlling weight? So the point is clear. You have if the consideration is discriminatory, then you have to address that on the merits and not try to ignore it the way Justice O'Connor did. But these logical arguments didn't prevail at the Supreme Court. Political reality did, and I really think the decision was driven. If you think the Supreme Court is in some ivory tower and doesn't read the headlines, it doesn't take account of the political situation, that's not the case. They were well aware that a lot of people in the arts world thought another such victory and we are undone, basically. If this law was struck down, the NEA would suffer drastic consequences. So we finally lost the Finley case, and the arts world could breathe a sigh of relief. The NEA was saved just barely because its already small $175 million budget in 1992 had shrunk radically in the fever of the culture wars over the 1990s, and almost all individual grant programs had been eliminated. So the Supreme Court's pragmatic, if analytically challenged decision confirmed what everybody knew by now. The US government is not very eager to subsidize the arts or any other form of communication, and if it grudgingly does so, there are usually political strings attached. So that's a somewhat longer cautionary tale than I intended, but to me the moral is plain. If government support for art or any other type of expression is important, then we need a better way of insulating the grant-making process from political grandstanding, arm-twisting, outraged cries of blasphemy, indecency, and other emotional buzzwords. Admittedly, grant programs have to be accountable, and grant givers can't ignore public opinion, but a balance needs to be struck, and fundamentally there needs to be public recognition that what's being funded, not only through arts or humanities endowments, but through public libraries, public universities, and other forums for intellectual activity, is the proverbial free marketplace of ideas. And I don't mean marketplace in the strictly financial sense, I mean it in the metaphorical sense. Just as neither taxpayers in general nor Jesse Helms-style demagogues in particular have the power under our system to approve or disapprove every idea in a book in a public library or every course taught at a public university, so we need to get it into our collective brains that that all literature, scholarship, and journalism that receives public funds doesn't have to be decent, respectful, or otherwise in accord with mainstream conservative morality. So in the time that's left, let me turn from these seemingly gloomy ruminations to some international comparisons, because this is International Free Expression Forum. So although Western Europe is hardly a paradise for free speech, its attitudes toward public subsidies for artistic and intellectual pursuits is considerably more generous and less politically interventionist than ours. Partly this comes from an embrace of social welfare and government regulation that's still ideologically dangerous terrain in the US, where libertarian opposition to government paternalism and celebration of private enterprise and individual choice are not always balanced with sufficient recognition of the injustices that result from radically unequal distribution of wealth, health, education, and cultural opportunities. Germany provides the most striking comparison. The musicologist William Osborne reports, for example, that Germany has one full-time year-round orchestra for every 590,000 people, while the United States has one for every 14 million. Germany has about 80 year-round opera houses, while the US, with more than 3 times the population, does not have any. We don't have any opera company in the US that's year-round. These numbers, Osborne says, mean that larger German cities often have several orchestras. Munich has 7 full-time year-round professional orchestras, 2 full-time year-round opera houses, as well as 2 full-time large spoken word theaters for a population of only 1.2 million. If America had the same ratios per capita as Germany, it would have 485 full-time year-round orchestras instead of about 20. If New York City had the same number of orchestras per capita as Munich, it would have about 45. And then he goes on with some other comparisons. And I guess he's from the Northeast, so most of these are from the Northeast. If America's Northeast seaboard had the same sort of orchestral landscape as Germany, there would be full-time year-round professional orchestras, often in conjunction with opera houses, in Long Island, Newark, New Jersey City, Trenton, Camden, Philadelphia. He's just going down the Amtrak list of train stops. Wilmington, Baltimore, New Haven, Hartford, Springfield, Providence, and Boston. California would have about 60 full-time year-round professional orchestras. Like Germany, the US would suffer from a shortage of good classical musicians in the sense that there would be plenty of employment for them, so there would be demand. So Osborne suggests that instead of music school graduates waiting tables or otherwise scavenging for work outside their chosen field because there are so few jobs in it, we'd have not only live classical music everywhere, but he says with that much creativity, quote, it's unlikely Americans would stick to European repertoire and models. Even with half the German ratios, a starkly American musical culture would evolve that would likely change history, end quote. Well, you may ask, do Americans really want that many orchestras and opera houses? Do we need a, quote, starkly American musical culture when we already have a wildly successful popular culture that's watched and listened to all over the world? Here's Osborne's answer. In Germany, he says, classical recordings compete strongly against pop. This is not merely a matter of history or coincidence. Europeans use their local public cultural institutions to educate their children, and this creates a wide appreciation for classical music. They support their local cultural institutions almost like they were sports teams. European society illustrates that music education leads to forms of creativity and autonomy that are often antithetic to mass media. Now, myself having visited Europe fairly often and observed the pervasiveness of pop culture, especially imports from America, I'm a little skeptical about the breadth of Osborne's claims about the love affair between young Europeans and classical music. But you can't argue with his statistical comparison. Our relative commitment to arts funding in Europe as opposed to America speaks for itself. And most important, he says, for purposes of this talk and this conference, and I'm quoting again, European politicians avoid attacking the arts for populist and opportunist political gain. This is a taboo that is seldom, if ever, broken, and the perpetrators generally only discredit themselves. Few mainstream European politicians would make such remarks as North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms, who said, quote, "The artists and the homosexuals ain't seen nothing yet," end quote. Europeans would find it absurd to eliminate almost half of their nation's arts funding because of 2 or 3 marginalized avant-garde artists. End quote from Osborne. Now, this isn't to say that theater, visual art, and even opera in Europe don't face controversy, especially if a work is considered racist, anti-Semitic, or just too avant-garde. But these occasional flare-ups, which you may read about from time to time, are really blips on the screen compared to what has gone on in America. Although the 1965 law that created the NEA, along with the National Endowment for the Humanities, contains some inspiring free expression language about the necessity for government to help create and sustain, quote, "a climate encouraging free thought, imagination, and inquiry." Ultimately, as we've seen from my cautionary tale, this nice free speech rhetoric hasn't squared with the facts of American political life. And of course, there are a couple of things that Osborne, in his enthusiasm for Germany, ignores. First, he doesn't count in his financial aid totals the contributions of America's state and local arts funding agencies. Admittedly, though, these are small. They face political challenges similar to the NEA's, and they're often the first on the chopping block when state budget deficits loom. Second, and more economically important, the nonprofit arts in the US, although hit hard by the current economic crunch, in stabler times get lots of foundation dollars, significant corporate contributions, and contributions from well-heeled individuals that are strongly encouraged by our charitable deductions in our tax system. And the argument in favor of this policy of mostly private arts funding is that individuals can vote with their pocketbooks rather than having a state bureaucracy decide what's culturally worthy. Jim Rutter, a dissenter from Osborne's arguments, claims that because Americans donated more than $29.4 billion to arts and culture in one typical year, 2003, total arts funding per capita in the US is really far higher, and the consequent output of art greater than in most European nations. That's what Rutter says. I would question his arguments also. He doesn't mention there are private donations in Europe. And again, the bottom line, as Osborne shows, is that Germany has lots more opera houses, symphony orchestras, and overall employment for musicians. And the same can be said of theater and other arts. So just one other quick comparison. England, the picture is similar, although with a more of a mix of public and private funding. The Arts Council of England gave away £1.1 billion in 2006 to 2008, and trusts and foundations donated another £2.1 billion a year to charities generally. So if we just look at the state contribution, £1.1 billion for 2 years is, even I can do this math, £550 million for 1 year, or about $800 million at present exchange rates. So $800 million per year government arts funding in England really dwarfs America's current $145 million annual appropriation for the NEA, and needless to say, comes from a lot smaller country. So the Arts Council of England, how do they deal with the fears or the prospect of political interference? They boast in a report that I read that individual funding decisions are taken at arm's length from the government, but then they do add, the Arts Council is expected to account for those decisions and explain them to the government, Parliament, and the general public. So this obviously isn't a great formula for total independence from politics, but that's probably an unrealistic goal anyway. The important point is that in practice, arts funding in England is well enough insulated that, as in Germany, controversies don't reach nearly the level of vitriol, hysteria, sensationalism, and anti-intellectualism that we saw during the American culture wars in the 90s. And much the same can be said for public broadcasting in the UK. The BBC is not totally insulated, but it hasn't been subjected to anything like the level of political interference that we saw, for example, 15 years ago here, when Newt Gingrich and others in Congress attacked the alleged liberal bias of National Public Radio, Or 5 years ago, when the chair of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a guy named Ken Tomlinson, started a campaign against Bill Moyers, the crusading PBS journalist, and appointed two of his right-wing pals as ombudsmen in order to put political pressure on public TV and radio stations. So this caused a bit of a scandal, and Tomlinson was forced to resign, but this sort of antic from a government funder tends to stick in the minds of editors. And public broadcasting in the US is simply a much more fragile and smaller operation than the BBC. And it's almost continually fighting for its life. And broadcasting that really offers a political alternative, such as Amy Goodman's Democracy Now!, which is probably the most visible example, is too small and marginal to compete with the commercial media for the eyes and ears of most Americans. And to add to the dilemma, public broadcasting here now receives only a small fraction of its funds from the government. That's why you hear ever more corporate sponsor announcements on NPR that sound distinctly like ads. But political pressure has had a powerful leveraging effect on public broadcasting. That's to say, with only a small contribution to their operating budgets, Congress can make NPR and PBS politically and culturally gun-shy in terms not only of how they spend their dwindling government money, but how they spend their private funds, the ones on which they now primarily rely. So I wouldn't want to leave you feeling too depressed on such a beautiful day. I don't think all is gloom and doom. Perhaps we Americans, traumatized by the current economic crisis, are finally getting over our romance with the commercialized free market, not only in finance, but in the arts, journalism, and the mass media, all of which, of course, rely on our financial institutions. If so, maybe we can start electing legislators who will expand our cultural and intellectual options by supporting nonprofit alternatives. Certainly with all the pump priming that's badly needed in all sectors of the economy right now, arts, humanities, and libraries, all of which do employ lots of people, deserve a major boost if we can figure out a way to do it without the kind of sensationalizing that's made funding speech here such a political quagmire in the past. Maybe in such a scenario there would be even room for an occasional chocolate-smeared artist. Thank you.
Take a seat over here. Hi, I'm going to invite two distinguished people to join us for the discussion session of our gathering today. Ladies first, Joanne Gordon is the chair of the Department of Theater Arts, a noted director of cutting-edge productions that have been praised by the Los Angeles Times and many other media. She is a nationally recognized expert on the work of Stephen Sondheim, and hence we've invited her to this panel. Secondly is Donald Parra, who is the Dean of the College of the Arts, where he is noted and greatly admired for his transparent leadership of the college. He is also a former faculty member from the Department of Music, hence his appearance here on our panel today on the arts. Joanne, do you have any opening kind of reaction that you would like to give before we get into a more gentle conversation?
Well, I think that one of the things that we have to note with Marjorie's attempt at ending with some kind of optimism is that in the current debate, how the National Endowment of the Arts has been thrown around, the very small amount of money that was in the stimulus package for the National Endowment of the Arts almost became a punchline for a joke. And the lack of respect and the lack of understanding of the necessity for the artist and the arts in our culture seems to become more and more apparent. But perhaps what might also be interesting to debate in this whole notion of free speech is concomitant with all our depressed news about the economy is the revelations of what was going on in the former administration in terms of the Big Brother activity. And as you hear from the accent, I did not grow up in this country. I grew up in South Africa, where government control of the arts was absolute. And the thing that I think that we have to be as American artists and as young Americans incredibly sensitive to and aware of is the notion of self-censorship. I think that one of the things that's most pernicious in our society is the prevalence of fear. We're frightened that primarily it seems to be of litigation in this country. You know, we may be sued. Where I was growing up, we could have landed in jail, and the fears were very real. So as artists, whether it's we're frightened that we won't get funded, or we're frightened that we'll land up in jail, I think that what we have to be most aware of is self-censorship. That artists and art organizations make decisions not on principle, but out of fear of losing their funding or fear of being eliminated completely.
Thank you, Joanne. Don?
Thank you, Craig. I don't come here today as an expert on the First Amendment or an expert on artistic free expression, but I do come here today as an artist and as a person who has dealt with arts and arts issues related to education, free expression, and as censorship issues that have related to those. I think that Marjorie and Joanne have eloquently expressed some of the issues that are related here. Joanne's comments about self-censorship really, and fear of litigation, fear of attack really ring home, I think, with a lot of us. I'd make one kind of a parallel observation, and that is, many of you may have read the article in the LA Times last weekend that asked a number of leaders, if you ran the NEA, what would you do? And one of the probably the most consistent comment was, we would put more funding for arts back in the schools. One of the kind of parallel things to this, I think, is the fact that arts education is being lost in this country. It has in so many ways been relegated to some kind of second-class status. Despite a lot of recent scientific evidence of how much the arts do and how important the arts are for our complete education. So the importance of arts and art expression in our country cannot be overstated.
Thank you, Don. I'm going to bounce off that LA Times survey that you talked about also. The other consistent theme was, including a comment by Tim Miller, who was mentioned earlier as one of the NEA4, that they would close the NEA down. And one argument that's often made, and I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit because few here are more qualified to be the devil's advocate. The way to end political pressure on the arts and PBS and the NPR, and I'd like your response to the panel's response to this, the way to end political pressure on the arts, PBS, and NPR is to get them off of public funding. I mean, we don't fund the History Channel, and it does fine, and we don't fund National Geographic, and it does fine. Why should we fund PBS?
I'd like to start with a response. A number of years ago, I was listening to National Public Radio, and there was a debate of European legislative leaders. They were covering a wide variety of topics, including public government funding for the arts. And the moderator, who was American, said, of course, in Europe, it's easy for you guys, the legislators, to put money into arts funding because we all know that everybody in Europe just loves the arts. And the legislators said a couple things. They said, that used to be more true than it is now. It's much more difficult now for us to support arts funding. People don't quite see it in the same way that they used to. But, and they summarized their comments by saying, but our culture is the hallmark of our societies. It is what we will leave to the generations that come after. Not the government works that we do and the other things, but our arts and culture. So these legislators said, we feel as if we are the guardians of that culture.
I'd like to add something too. I think that as much as we would like to embrace the intellect of the masses, well, maybe we wouldn't.
Speak for yourself.
The truth is that all of us have a certain inertia, a certain laziness. And if you look at any artist, whether you look at somebody who's sort of as really not elitist as an artist in terms of Sondheim, or somebody more, and my field being theater, my examples will be theatrical ones, but someone like Beckett, if you look at UNESCO, if you look at any artist who has made a breakthrough and changed the form, the initial reaction is always confusion and rejection, because we like to go to what we know. They always say to me, well, you know, how do you choose your seasons? If I was simply to choose my seasons in terms of box office, which I would have to do if I was a commercial theater and unsupported by state dollars, I know exactly how I could make money. I simply keep bringing back things that are popular that people know. If you're going to constantly break the barriers, restructure our thought, and that is the only way as a culture we can move forward. It's rethinking our parameters, rethinking our reality, which comes from the creative artist and then spills through into science, into every way of thinking. We have to have support to do this. And it's not going to come through commercial appeasement of the common taste.
Mark?
Yeah, I would just add that the government, it's a mistake, it's an illusion to think the government doesn't intervene and government policy doesn't have an effect on the mass market commercial culture that we have. So to say, oh, well, we shouldn't fund PBS or the NEA, but to leave in place tax policies that support the choices of the very rich and as to what they want to donate to charitable donations. Regulatory policies or lack of regulatory policies that allow media corporations to grow humongous because the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission and the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department are just allowing that to happen and attempting to, certainly under the previous administration, attempting to get rid of rules that prevent newspapers from becoming one newspaper towns, and as we've seen more recently, no newspaper towns, cross ownership of radio and TV. So the hand of government regulation is everywhere in our legal system, in our corporate policy, in our tax policy. So to say somehow that direct funding is forbidden, but all these other forms of government regulation and control which shape our culture are not, is to misunderstand the nature of the problem.
Yeah, I think that's true. And you know, those favoring that position often say that private funding is what made the Renaissance possible. They cite the Medicis in Florence, for example. But of course, the Medicis were the government in Florence. The Sforzas were the government in Milan. And of course, the Pope was the government in Rome. I want to open this to the field, and let's start. We have a microphone roaming, and Julie Van Camp, professor of philosophy.
I am enjoying this so much. Let me tell the audience, this is a distinguished group. We're fortunate to have them here. I wanted to just follow up on this last question and to go into a little more detail. When the two endowments were founded in '65, and for the next couple of decades, if you look at the legislative history and the hearings and the agency's image of itself, it was precisely to do the high-risk ventures that the commercial profit-making sector would not touch. And of course, since the controversies of the 90s, they've all backed away from anything risky because they are afraid the agencies will get shut down. But I want to give you a couple real quick examples of what used to be the pioneering spirit that we've lost and need to get back to. You might remember in the late 1970s, WGBH, the public television station in Boston, wanted to do a definitive history, the first ever, of the Vietnam War that would look fairly across the board. You know, those of us who grew up in the Vietnam era remember the gaping wounds of the 70s. This was the first attempt to do a fair history. No private funder would touch it, no foundation would touch it, no corporation would touch it. National Endowment for the Humanities funded that thing to their great credit. It was in the Carter administration under Joe Duffy. A second example was this wonderful series you've seen in our bookstores called the Library of America, with the black covers and the acid-free paper, the definitive series of American writers. Again in the 70s, no commercial publisher would touch it. The European countries had the definitive pride editions of their native writers. We had nothing like that. Again, commercial publishers said, this is not commercially viable, we won't go near it. Joe Duffy went out for bids, we'll subsidize it for you. Nobody would even bid on it. He ended up giving a sole source contract to Norton. It's been a great success, and it has preserved our literary heritage. I think the sad thing about the controversies that you were discussing in the 90s, they've lost that sense of taking a chance, of doing what the private sector won't do, and I hope that we can get back to that at some point. I'd be interested, especially in where do we go in this horrible economy to retrieve that sense of the mission of these agencies to get back to that spirit. So
I might just interrupt before that. Julie referred to us as a distinguished panel. Julie herself was on the advisory board of the Free Expression Policy Project, of which Marjorie was the director. So, and I've read a lot of Julie's works on First Amendment, free expression, et cetera. So, certainly a distinguished member of this group as well.
Can I follow up on that? Because this is a question I sort of raise, and of course, as I say, we'll never know. But before the culture wars, before the Serrano and Mapplethorpe scandals, the NEA had not been totally free of attack, and probably not the NEH either. And two of the famous examples, which now seem in retrospect quite trivial, but maybe weren't at the time, was one time Representative Biaggi, Italian-American, attacked NEA funding of a Metropolitan Opera production of Rigoletto because all the Duke's corrupt courtiers were dressed as mafiosi, and he said it was an insult to Italian-Americans. How can this be funded? And this led to congressional hearings. And the NEA chair at the time came forward with support from others, and with those in Congress who supported free expression, and explained that the purpose is not to fund things that will never offend anybody, but to fund a range of artistic enterprises and experiments. Another example was Erica Jong, when she got an artist grant, which resulted in the book Fear of Flying, which might seem tame to us, but at the time was considered quite an eye-opener about female sexuality, and that was attacked. And the defense, one funny story about the defense is that the NEA defended it by pretending it was a book about aeronautics, but I don't think so. So, you know, now Serrano and Mapplethorpe sort of raised the ante, but if the arts community had come together in a different way, instead of backing away from these controversial artists and saying, oh, the NEA is going to be more cautious and careful, and in fact, becoming more cautious and careful. If there had been a different response, could the Helms rhetoric have been beaten back? And would we have scored some gains in terms of support for an arts agency that's not so crippled by these ideological fears? You know, we'll never know, but what do you think?
Can I just, because I want to address the immediacy of the now. It's kind of a depressing but fascinating observation, being a theater person. We're sitting in a nice, comfortable, beautiful California day, and there was a group of kids who clearly were asked to come here as a class. And they have quietly all drifted. You're sitting facing forward, so you can't see what we see. But there was this entire group of young people, all between 18 and 20, who have just quietly drifted out because they heard the speaker, and then their class, it was over. I think that one of the things that we might be very lucky to be facing the worst economic disaster since the Depression, because those kids are so unconscious of what is going on and how critical the artist is going to be to their survival, that maybe this disaster is a good thing. Maybe, as we did in the Depression, the recognition of things like the WPA, we will once again discover how our artists can be used to regenerate the spirit and culture of a country. And that I just feel very passionately about this, because I lived in a society where we couldn't speak up, and these kids do not understand how important our desperately important it is in this particular time to recognize that our freedom of speech was in danger of being eradicated, and it was our artists who were at the forefront of defending it. And so I'll keep quiet.
Thank you for that passionate appeal. Perhaps they had an 11 o'clock class. Don?
Just another comment. I think it can generally be said that art that survives has seldom been safe. We would hardly think today of Mozart opera as being in any way controversial. But the fact is, when Mozart was writing those operas, they were, for a variety of reasons, political and otherwise, highly controversial. But what he was doing, among other things, is pushing boundaries. When he wanted to set one of his operas, a comic opera, in a brothel, people were, of course, scandalized. It doesn't seem to bother people today. It's one of his most well-known operas. Mozart is a musical genius. It's a masterpiece. But most of art, I presume, that survives, that means something, has not been safe art.
Thank you. Good example. Is there another question from the floor? Yeah?
I'll ask one since I have the microphone. I know there was some controversy over the inclusion of funding for the arts and artists in the discussions about the federal stimulus package. I'm not quite sure how those discussions ever turned out, because I'm not sure we figured out what exactly ended up in that package. But I'm wondering if anyone wants to comment on that discussion, and is it too early to predict any signals from the new administration about how these changes might be forthcoming in a direction that Joanne was anticipating?
Well, of course, public stimulus funds were used during the New Deal to fund artists and plays and things like that. Comments from any of you too?
Well, I think I did mention the fact that it was already so easily used by the Republicans as the butt of the joke, that there was money being given for this fictional train from Disneyland to the Bunny Ranch, and money given to the arts, and they were put as equivalent jokes. And I think that's catastrophic in terms of an attitude of respect to culture. But, you know, if Rush Limbaugh is going to be their head, then so be it. I think what's perhaps more terrifying is within the new tax code, one of the things suggested is that charitable giving will no longer have the same tax deductions, and I think the threat to the arts in terms of a very real numbers is probably and if you'd read Obama's statement, because all of the candidates did put out statements, he was very positive towards the arts, and particularly arts education. And if we're going to lose those charitable deductions in terms of the tax code, I think this could have a really terrifying impact on arts funding.
I guess I would just add that, you know, my sense is that the Obama administration wants this stimulus package to go forward. And if increasing funding to the arts is going to be controversial or a joke, and it's clear that the political culture, the political climate's changed since the 90s because the NEA has been completely neutered. And we don't have those front page headlines anymore, but the political climate hasn't changed, I don't think, in the sense, the political culture hasn't changed in the sense that the understanding that I think we need, that arts funding is like funding libraries or universities. These are areas for free expression and not for the promotion of only certain acceptable views. Until that changes, this is going to be too politically risky. And, you know, how do we bring about that change? That's why I go back to the question, if the strategy of the arts community had been different in the 90s, would we now have a different result, or perhaps a better result, or perhaps a worse result?
I would also challenge everybody to look closely at the president's budget. There are only 2 departments that were cut. Defense was cut slightly, and education suffered a very large cut. Any other questions from the floor?
Hi, my name's Lionel. I've just got a question for Marjorie and the rest of the panel in regards to the Jesse Helms case. I understand there was a conflict of interest with Philip Morris, the cigarette company, was funding Jesse Helms considerably, and Philip Morris was also funding the NEA at the time, and I've seen this several other examples of conflicts of interest apparent in the corporatisation of funding as arts become more corporate. And ever since the 90s, like you were saying, like the emergence of neoliberalism in the Ronald Reagan era, things have changed and they are becoming more corporate. I was wondering if you and the panel had a specific sort of a solution that what we could look at, because we know corporate funding is a reality of the arts, and but we know that it is also tied into politics. How can we look to the future in balancing this between corporate and politics within the arts, and helping it to be more free in the expression and not to affect the actual product of the artistic creation?
Well, I doubt that Philip Morris contributed to the NEA, but they certainly have contributed to the arts. And they started doing that in a big way around the same time that they were getting a very bad rap for promoting a toxic product for so many years. So it was a PR was the motivation to improve their image by supporting the arts and a lot of other charitable activities. And ironically, I think, I'm not a huge defender of corporate funding of the arts, but ironically I think there was less control, less political pressure towards self-censorship from corporate funding. I think Philip Morris and other corporations that provided funding the arts adopted more of a hands-off approach than the government by necessity had to, given all the pressures. But I'll tell one story about Philip Morris. What they cared about was making money and promoting, improving their public image so that they can continue to make money for all their products, including cigarettes. So that, although I don't think they interfered in artistic productions and demanded that, their cigarettes be, placed in the theater, in a scene, in a show, they did give a grant to the ACLU while I was there for a product called, for a special project on workplace privacy and workers' rights. And what they really were interested in was to fight corporate efforts to ban smoking in the workplace under the guise of workers' rights to smoke. And this caused a bit of controversy internally at the ACLU.
I mean, clearly any kind of funding comes with strings. In South Africa, when I grew up, there was quite liberal government funding of art, but it was approved art. It was only art that supported the government position. The funding in the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, was extraordinarily generous to the artist, but it was the legislated art that they wanted. So finding that kind of balance between artistic freedom, freedom of speech, and the artist and funding is always a complex thing.
Yeah, I'll answer this question as a bureaucrat, and that is, when people want to give you money, you find out where it is that they want to give you money. One of the things that most corporations or other people are happy to provide money for is some kind of arts education. It's uncontroversial, it makes everybody feel good, and of course it makes a great deal of sense. So I guess my response is going to be, as an aside to these, corporate funding, we need it. We will help tailor it as best we can. We'll accept it where it wants to go. We'll fill in needs with corporate funding, and then we'll look for funding for other places to fund more important artistic work.
Good, thank you. Let me intervene with one question, and it gets back to something Joanne said earlier. One of the people I really admire during the NEA fight was Jane Alexander, who stayed poised, and she was head of the NEA, and she answered questions from various people when she had to appear before Congress. But Joanne, how do we know the difference between what's cutting edge and what's schlock? I mean, what criteria do you apply?
Well, I think that this is where, as academics, we can hold our heads up high and talk about education. I have no problem. Somehow the word elite became a dirty word somewhere in the 70s. And I think that's shameful. I think there is no problem. You wouldn't want your neurosurgeon to be the least educated common man you could find. I don't want Joe the plumber doing my neurosurgery, and I don't want him deciding what I should read and what art I should see and what theater piece is good. I think that we should be unashamed that the artist is aspiring to the highest intellectual, emotional, and creative instincts, and that we refine these instincts, and they can be taught and studied, and it's not the dictates of the masses, but an elite, educated decision who determines which is schlock and which is cutting edge.
I would only add to that that anti-elitism didn't start with the culture wars. It goes back, way back in American history, certainly back to the 50s, the era of political blacklisting, and you heard something about blacklisting a couple of days ago, I think. So it's a long-standing tradition that we have.
How sad.
Out of curiosity, what would be the constitutional basis for funding of the arts?
Well, there's no constitutional basis. I mean, nobody has ever said there's a constitutional right to any kind of funding. But there's a long-standing doctrine in constitutional law called unconstitutional conditions, which basically says the government can't try to accomplish a restriction or an invasion of constitutionally protected rights through the mechanism of putting a condition on a government benefit or funding program. And that doctrine, it took a long time for that doctrine to evolve. Way back in the 1890s, Justice Holmes, when he was still on the Massachusetts Supreme Court, there was a case that came up to the court of a policeman who said he'd been fired for exercising his First Amendment right to freedom of speech. And Justice Holmes famously remarked, he may have a constitutional right to talk politics, but he has no constitutional right to be a policeman. Holmes was great at the simplistic, catchy epigram, which was totally wrong, because it took a long time after that for the society and the courts to appreciate that we do need our livelihoods, that to punish somebody or censor somebody who's exercising a right to political speech by depriving them of their job is as effective, if not more effective, than directly banning the speech or imposing a fine. Let's say you're fined $500. That's a lot easier to take than losing your job. So it took a long time for this doctrine that there is such a thing as an unconstitutional condition. No right to funding, no right to the benefit, but if it's going to be provided, you can't condition it on. And some of the examples I read from Justice Souter's dissent in Finley, you can't condition the funding on, to what extent does this artist support or not support Christianity or any other political doctrine. So how did this unconstitutional conditions doctrine come about? There were cases, again, going back to the political repression of the 1950s. There were loyalty programs everywhere, all kinds of benefits, primarily employment, but many other benefits, both state and federal, were conditioned on a loyalty oath or a provision that a person was not associated or had never been associated with any left-wing organization, a communist organization, a communist front organization, a communist sympathized organization. So one of the cases that came up to the Supreme Court was a case out of California, because California was in the forefront of this stuff, and California had passed a law that said anybody who applies for a property tax exemption has to sign a loyalty oath. And whoever brought the case picked the plaintiffs well. They were honorably discharged World War II veterans who would not sign this loyalty oath. The Supreme Court said, even though it's a benefit, they're not being required to sign it, but if they want the tax exemption, they have to sign it. The Supreme Court said, this is unconstitutional for a variety of reasons, including that it would have a chilling effect on freedom of expression and association. And other cases came along sort of to the same effect, but then it doesn't always work that way. One of the famous cases, and this is again Rehnquist, who was not a believer in this doctrine for the most part. A case came along in the 1980s, early 1990s, it was either the Reagan or the first Bush administration, had a gag rule requiring, and this has continued on to the present, whether, keeps changing back and forth, whichever the administration is, requiring any family planning clinics that received federal aid to have a very, not only not to supply abortion services, not to even talk about abortion, not to even mention it to a pregnant woman who came in, and if she asked, to give a government-dictated anti-abortion speech, the so-called gag rule. And it was a condition on funding. You didn't have to take the funds, but you might not be able to keep your family planning clinic running if you didn't. So this got challenged, and Rehnquist wrote a famous decision which said, if you don't like the condition, don't take the funds. And he sort of ignored the problem of unconstitutional conditions. So it goes back and forth. And in the Finley case, for a variety of reasons, the court did not think that this was an unconstitutional condition. But importantly, Justice O'Connor wrote, if it were shown, as I mentioned, she sort of defanged the law. She pretended the law really didn't have any effect. But, if it were shown in some future case that this law was applied in a way that discriminated against an artist with a particular political viewpoint, then we would have a different case, because the law is that kind of thing would be an unconstitutional condition. Long constitutional law answer, but.
Any other questions? Yes. Professor Vieira.
One of the things that we've seen in this forum is this moment of sort of radical change and things happening, the internet and what all that is meaning, or the change in journalism is just mind-boggling at the moment, these really new paradigm shifts. And so I wondered, Marjorie, if you'd like to comment or would comment on what you see, if you see some major, major shifts, especially given Joanne's idea that this is a moment of crisis and things are changing. So maybe in a positive way, what are new framing of the issues that we could do, new ways of looking at it, saying, because the old things are, in a way, maybe if you had it, is there some positive new way that you would like to see, this is kind of a visionary question, of changing the way that this relationship between arts and funding and government has happened? Is there some new cutting edge future way of looking at this?
Well, I'm going to say something very sacrilegious. I don't like blogs. I don't think blogs are going to substitute for journalism. But having said that, I recognize that some blogs, at least, have had a very positive effect on public discourse and awareness and information. But I would like to see some way to revive the print media, the newspaper that you hold in your hand. I'm really scared by these online reading. Not only the book, you don't have to buy the book and hold it in your hand and have it in the bookshelf. You can just read it on a computer screen. And I see this with my students. Everybody's supposed to give the students the option of buying a course pack or having all the materials on e-reserves. So they don't have to buy the course pack, they just read the materials on the computer. And you can ask them to print it out, but they don't. So they don't have them in class when you want to talk about them. And this may be very old-fashioned or wrong, but I don't think a student or anybody can study and understand and absorb a text as well, looking at it on the computer screen, without a highlighter as they can if they have it in front of them. And that may be just a question of my lack of computer literacy, but I certainly find it easier to comprehend the thing when it's on paper. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't know what mechanisms might be developed to support the continuation of print media. But it does seem like we need to start looking at how to develop foundation support, nonprofit support, subscriber support, and look to try to build the nonprofit alternative.
Taking it a different way.
Joanne, is the
yeah,
theater going to live at all?
Well, I think that, interestingly enough, I think that in many ways, the web and everything about the computer culture is going to be the savior of the theater, because so much that we can do in terms of entertainment and self-made art and so on. I mean, the liberation of the visual artist in terms of the screen, in terms of making movies and so on is extraordinary, and it's just going to get faster and better and so on. But the notion of community of artists, people wanting to come and be with live other people, seeing other live people, I think that the theater is going to benefit. Where film, you know, as we have our entertainment center at home and it gets bigger and smarter and better and we can interact with it and so on, and it becomes a really vital and vibrant and different art medium, which I think it's going to. Nothing will substitute for the sweating, farting body touching another sweating, farting body in a group of sweating, farting bodies, and I think that we long for that. And so I think that theater is going to profit by it all.
I'm a musician, I'm a composer. I was in school in the 60s when electronically generated music, computer generated music kind of became popular, Moose synthesizer, etc. When that happened, there were two quick reactions. One, oh my God, this is the end of live music forever. The other side was, this is baloney, it's a passing phase, it'll go away, don't worry about it. Well, the latter, clearly, you don't put things back in the bottle that are like that. They're there, you have to live with them. Regarding the first comment about it's the end of live music, to some extent that's become the case. You know, Las Vegas used to be live musicians. You go very few places now where live musicians perform in Las Vegas. Not that that's the height of culture or something that we should strive for. But there certainly has been a reality. You used to have every movie supported by a live orchestra. Now, most of the scores are electronically produced. That's another reality. You can do things electronically that you can't do with live instruments and vice versa. Listening to a electronic composition in a concert hall is generally not very satisfying because you don't see the energy of the musicians, etc. But following up on some of the things that have been said, a musician, a composer can sit in front of a computer screen with the appropriate software and create art on their own, and it doesn't have to be just what you can play on a piano by yourself. They can layer and do the other kind of things that allow them tremendous freedom and expression and experimentation. So it really is, I mean, I tend to be an optimistic kind of a guy. So I look at that as a real opportunity for future expansion of people touching the arts and being able to be part of the arts on their own terms.
Thank you. I want to close this panel and our forum on human rights with a couple of examples and just a quick comment. And I want to thank everybody for participating, for supporting these, the support of our provost, Karen Gould, various deans, professors who brought their students, students who wandered in on their own, community members, all of whom have participated. The first example is from Senator Paul Simon. He was a Democrat, a liberal from Illinois, had a little bow tie and big ears, everybody liked him. He wanted to ban the Roadrunner cartoons on morning television because he thought they were too violent. Take the contrasting example of the composer Prokofiev in the Soviet Union when he was brought before the Stalin trials. Instead of answering questions, he took his chair and moved around and faced the wall and refused to recognize the court. And he survived. Freedom of expression is important because it provides a battleground where the truth, we hope, will emerge if we are all left free to say what we want, when we can examine the evidence, when we can sort through the arguments. Freedom of religion is also very important because it provides us with individual pathways to spirit which give us the inspiration to create the art that we all love and applaud. Thank you and good afternoon.